Marianne Holt was known as a graceful widow. Adrian Holt was her quiet, devoted son. Together, they looked like the picture of resilience in a small town. But behind closed doors, their story hid one of the most disturbing secrets imaginable. When the truth came out that Marianne had married her own son, the world was left horrified. What drove a mother to cross every boundary of morality? And how did a young man become trapped in her web of obsession? This is the terrifying case of the Holts, a story that will haunt you long after it ends. Millbrook was the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors and neighbors waved from their porches without hesitation. The town had a way of making everyone feel safe, almost insulated from the darker realities of the outside world. Tucked away in this quiet community was a small, ivy-covered house at the end of a cul-de-sac, and inside it lived Marianne Holt and her only son, Adrian. From a distance, they seemed like the perfect example of resilience. Marianne had lost her husband Edwin to a sudden heart attack when Adrian was still a teenager, and since then, she carried the reputation of a strong, graceful widow who dedicated her life to raising her boy. People admired her composure, the way she carried herself at church gatherings, and how she never missed one of Adrian's school events. Adrian, in turn, grew into a quiet, well-mannered young man. He was tall, reserved, and intelligent, though many noticed he rarely formed close friendships outside of his mother. Most chalked it up to grief, believing that losing his father had drawn him closer to Marianne. It was easy to think of them as two people clinging to each other for comfort. Whenever Adrian was seen around town, Marianne was usually just a step behind. They went grocery shopping together, attended small-town festivals side by side, and even shared hobbies that most young adults would prefer to enjoy with their peers. To outsiders, it looked unusual, but it wasn't enough to raise alarms. After all, Millbrook was filled with long-standing traditions and close-knit families. Yet, beneath the polished surface, people began to notice small details that didn't quite fit the picture. Marianne treated Adrian less like a son and more like a partner. When other young men his age began dating, Adrian never seemed to show interest. Instead, he was always seen on long walks with Marianne, dining at quiet restaurants where they sat across from each other for hours, and attending out-of-town trips that excluded anyone else. Some neighbors whispered about how she would dress up for these outings, as if preparing for a romantic dinner rather than a family meal. A few even remarked on how they looked more like a couple than a mother and child. But Millbrook was not a place where gossip traveled far. People had their suspicions, but no one dared to speak them aloud. At least, not publicly. To challenge Marianne was to risk looking cruel or insensitive. She had endured tragedy, and most people were sympathetic, giving her the benefit of the doubt. They told themselves that her attachment to Adrian was nothing more than the lingering wound of losing her husband too soon. And Adrian, for his part, never contradicted her closeness. He followed along silently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Still, the unease remained. The Holt house became a symbol of quiet speculation. Neighbors passing by noticed how the blinds were often drawn, how lights stayed on late into the night, and how laughter inside sometimes carried a strange, unsettling tone. What went on behind those closed doors was a mystery, but the town soon realized that their imagination hadn't stretched nearly far enough. Something disturbing was growing there, something that would eventually erupt into a scandal no one could ignore. It was during one particularly warm summer evening that the lives of Millbrook residents were forever changed. The Holts invited a small circle of neighbors and distant relatives to their home for what seemed like an ordinary dinner gathering. Marianne, known for her polished charm and flawless hosting skills, prepared the evening with great care. The dining table was neatly set with shining cutlery, fresh flowers, and soft candlelight that cast a golden glow across the room. Guests arrived expecting a pleasant night filled with polite conversation and perhaps a touch of nostalgia about the past. No one could have imagined that what began as an innocent gathering would turn into the beginning of a scandal so shocking it would stain the town's history. As the night progressed, Marianne moved through the room with ease, offering drinks, making sure everyone felt attended to. Adrian stayed close by her side, calm and collected, though some noticed an unusual stiffness in his manner, as though he were preparing himself for something monumental. For most of the evening, their behavior was simply seen as affectionate. But then, when the plates were cleared and the room settled into a quieter rhythm, she cleared her throat and announced to the guests that she and Adrian were now husband and wife. At first, silence filled the room. Those words seemed so absurd that no one reacted. A few chuckled nervously, thinking it was an ill-timed joke or perhaps a poorly chosen toast. But Marianne did not laugh. Her face remained steady, and Adrian, though visibly tense, nodded, as if confirming what she had just declared. Then, to erase any doubt, Marianne reached into a small drawer and produced a folded piece of paper. It was an official marriage certificate, stamped and signed, bearing their names. The air inside the Holt house grew heavy. Shock turned to horror as guests leaned closer to read what was in front of them. It was true. Somehow, in another county, paperwork had been processed and approved without anyone realizing that the pair were mother and son. They had traveled, manipulated details, and filed documents in a way that concealed their true relationship. Everything about the certificate was legal on paper, even though the reality behind it was unspeakable. The reactions were immediate. Some guests excused themselves quickly, faces pale with disbelief, muttering under their breath as they left the house. Others stayed frozen, unable to comprehend the scene before them. The story of Marianne's undying devotion had just taken on a grotesque and terrifying meaning. This was no longer a grieving mother clinging to her son. This was something that defied all moral boundaries. Within hours, word spread like wildfire across Millbrook. Gossip poured through the community, fueled by disgust, outrage, and confusion. How had no one seen it coming? How had a mother managed to convince her son to stand at her side as her husband? The small town, once quiet and trusting, now felt violated by the revelation. People began looking back at every small detail they had once ignored: the way Marianne dressed up for dinners, the trips taken in secret, the way Adrian had seemed distant from his peers, and realized those oddities were warning signs they had chosen not to confront. The announcement had stripped away the veil, and now Millbrook faced a truth so disturbing that no one could easily look away. When investigators began to pull apart the strange and unsettling marriage between Marianne and Adrian Holt, what surfaced was even more disturbing than the announcement itself. On the surface, it seemed like an act of delusion, the kind of bizarre decision that could only come from a woman unwilling to let go of her child. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that Marianne's decision was not impulsive. It was calculated. Years earlier, when her husband Edwin died suddenly, he left behind a sizable trust fund. That money was intended to secure Adrian's future. With clear conditions laid out, Adrian would have access to it when he reached adulthood, and no one else would be able to touch it. Marianne, though still comfortable, had grown used to a life of financial security during her marriage, and when Edwin was gone, she found herself depending on a far smaller income. The trust fund became an obsession for her, not just as a source of wealth, but as a way to regain the control and lifestyle she had once enjoyed. Over time, Marianne pieced together a disturbing plan. If she could prevent Adrian from separating from her, if she could bind him permanently to her life, she would ensure both emotional and financial dominance. The trust's fine print contained a loophole. If Adrian were to marry, his spouse would share in his inheritance. Marianne twisted that detail into an opportunity. To anyone else, the thought of marrying her own son would be unthinkable, but to her, it became the perfect solution. By securing Adrian as her husband, she could legally access the fortune. And by cloaking the marriage under secrecy, she could keep anyone from stopping her. But money was not the only driving force. Marianne had always feared abandonment, and as Adrian grew older, her paranoia intensified. The possibility of him meeting another woman, falling in love, and starting a life independent of her filled her with dread. To Marianne, losing him meant more than loneliness. It meant betrayal. She began grooming him slowly, blurring the boundaries of their relationship, convincing him that no one could love or understand him the way she did. Adrian, raised under her careful watch, never had the freedom to form his own identity. What felt suffocating to outsiders felt normal to him because it was all he had ever known. By the time the marriage was arranged, Adrian was deeply entangled in her control. Investigators described his demeanor as quiet, almost detached, as if he were merely carrying out instructions rather than making choices for himself. Friends who saw him during those months noticed a change in his behavior. He looked exhausted, distracted, and uneasy, though he never spoke openly about what was happening at home. It was as though the very foundation of his life was a cage built so skillfully that he could not even recognize it as one. When prosecutors later revealed the financial documents, the transfers Marianne attempted to initiate, and her frantic efforts to hide the true nature of their relationship, the picture became horrifyingly clear. What had shocked the town as a twisted display of love was in reality the product of greed, control, and psychological manipulation carried out over years. Marianne had not just broken moral boundaries, she had designed her entire life around exploiting her own son. The announcement of the marriage was only the beginning of the nightmare. Once word spread beyond Millbrook, outrage grew like a fire that could not be controlled. The Holt name, once spoken with respect, became associated with whispers, disgust, and anger. Journalists began arriving from nearby cities, cameras flashing outside the small ivy-covered house where Marianne and Adrian lived. Reporters stood on sidewalks, questioning neighbors and demanding answers from officials. The quiet town, which had never seen this kind of attention, suddenly became the center of a national scandal. Residents who had once defended Marianne as a grieving widow now avoided her entirely. People crossed the street rather than meet her eyes, and the once friendly greetings she received were replaced by stares filled with judgment. Inside the house, the pressure was crushing. Marianne, however, acted as though she had nothing to hide. She posed calmly when caught on camera, answering questions with vague smiles and insisting she and Adrian had chosen their life freely. Her refusal to show shame only fueled public anger. While she portrayed herself as misunderstood, Adrian appeared more fragile by the day. Those who saw him around town said he looked haunted, wandering aimlessly at night, shoulders slumped as though carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were filled with hesitation. There were hints of a young man trying to break free, yet terrified of the consequences. The situation escalated when officials began to investigate the legality of the marriage and the trust fund. Court documents showed that Marianne had traveled to another county, using her maiden name and omitting details that would have exposed their true relationship. The marriage had slipped through the cracks of bureaucracy, and though technically legal on paper, it was a deception from the start. Prosecutors built a case, charging her with fraud, coercion, and abuse. The community, outraged and restless, demanded justice. When the trial began, the courthouse was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and townspeople who wanted to see Marianne held accountable. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. As the prosecution laid out evidence of her manipulation, financial motives, and grooming of her son, the story transformed from shocking scandal to something far darker. Witnesses took the stand, recalling the years of unusual closeness, the trips taken in secret, the way Adrian never formed relationships outside of his mother. Each testimony painted Marianne not as a devoted parent, but as a woman who had orchestrated control over every part of her son's life. The most powerful moment came when Adrian himself testified. His voice was low, unsteady, but his words carried the weight of years of silence. He described feeling trapped, unable to imagine a life away from his mother, constantly told that no one else would ever love him or understand him. He spoke about the fear of disappointing her, the confusion of boundaries blurred beyond recognition, and the moment he realized he was being used not only as a son, but as a tool for her greed. His testimony silenced the room, leaving even the harshest critics shaken by the depth of his suffering. By the time closing arguments were made, there was little doubt about what had taken place inside the Holt household. The town that once pitied Marianne now saw her as a predator. The courtroom became a stage for the community's outrage, and the verdict would soon decide not only her fate, but the lasting legacy of the case. The verdict was delivered on a rainy afternoon, the kind of day when the sky itself seemed heavy with judgment. Marianne Holt sat motionless as the judge read the sentence: decades in prison for fraud, coercion, and abuse. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some relieved, some still stunned by the sheer audacity of her crimes. Adrian sat a few rows behind her, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the ground. For the first time in years, he was free from her control, yet freedom came with its own burden. The life he had known, twisted and suffocating as it was, had been destroyed in front of the world. His name was plastered across headlines, his most private horrors dissected on television screens, and his identity forever bound to a crime that seemed too disturbing to believe. Marianne showed little emotion as she was led away. She carried herself with the same composure she always had, as though convinced she had done nothing wrong. Some described her look as proud, others as detached. It was as if she believed that the world had misunderstood her, and that, in her own mind, she had acted out of love. That cold certainty chilled everyone who saw her. There was no remorse, no recognition of the destruction she had caused. In the months that followed, Adrian tried to rebuild a life for himself, though it was a path marked by deep scars. He changed his name and moved away from Millbrook, seeking a place where no one recognized him. But the past clung to him like a shadow. Every time he met someone new, he worried that they might uncover the truth. Trust became difficult, relationships nearly impossible, and the echoes of his mother's control haunted him in unexpected ways. For years, he struggled with the question of who he truly was beyond her influence. Back in Millbrook, the Holt house stood as a symbol of unease. The once charming home with its ivy-covered walls grew neglected. Neighbors passed by quickly, avoiding the sight of the drawn blinds and the silence that hung over the property. Some said they could still hear laughter at night, a chilling memory of the life that had once thrived inside. Parents used the story as a warning for their children, a reminder that evil can sometimes wear the mask of love and respectability. The case became a permanent part of the town's history, whispered about in classrooms, retold in hushed tones at family dinners, never fully fading from memory. Even years later, documentaries, articles, and podcasts revisited the Holt story, each time shocking a new audience with its twisted details. Marianne remained behind bars, her name synonymous with betrayal, while Adrian's absence from public life only deepened the sense of tragedy. People wondered what had become of him, whether he had managed to escape the shadows of his past, or if he carried them wherever he went. The legacy of the case was more than scandal. It was a reminder of how far obsession and control could go when left unchecked. It forced people to question how much they really knew about the families living next door. To this day, the story of Marianne and Adrian Holt lingers like a ghost in Millbrook, a terrifying reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors are not born in darkness, but in the places we trust the most.